So let's talk about people getting punched in the face, shall we? There's one match that really sticks in my mind when I think about modern internet-poisoned boxing. Mike Tyson versus Jake Paul. In November of 2024, the world watched as a 58-year-old former heavyweight boxing champion, a man who once called himself the greatest fighter since the conception of God, stepped into a ring to fight a YouTuber. And he lost. His opponent, Jake Paul, won via 8-round unanimous decision. With 108 million live global viewers, this was the most streamed sporting event in human history. And yes, I was one of the people, sat there on my couch watching a man with 20 million subscribers, a Netflix deal, and a promotional company built on the idea that his mastery of the attention economy was a more bankable credential than his mastery in the ring, outbox a man who was once the scariest human being alive. These kind of events are happening more and more lately, and recently I found myself asking a very strange question. Whose fault is this? It didn't arrive fully formed like the goddess Aphrodite, who, as I'm sure you'll recall from your ancient history lessons, was born from sea foam created when Uranus's severed testicles were thrown into the ocean. It had to come from somewhere. It had to develop and grow, so whose fault is this? I mean, it's a billion-dollar industry. If we rewind it a little bit, there's, I guess, brand risk boxing. This is a promotion built on the idea that influencer boxing has matured to the point where you don't need a Logan Paul or a KSI to sell tickets anymore. This is backed by Aiden Ross, a streamer with enough accumulated controversy that he now lives on Kick, a platform whose entire identity is taking the content that YouTube and Twitch decide they don't want. Kick, for their part, are quite happy to have him, mostly because they're bankrolled by a gambling company, and Aiden brings a young and impressionable audience. It's going, at least. Before Brand Risk, we had Creator Clash. This was the brainchild of iDubbbz, a YouTuber who spent a decade making the most watched takedown vids on the platform, and then when that died off, pivoted into running a charity boxing promotion. It had its moments, and then it died. Before Creator Clash, there was KSI. He's one of the biggest YouTubers in Britain, and in 2018 he decided he wanted to actually get in the ring and hit someone in the face. He sold out an arena doing it. Twice. The live streams outsold every professional boxing pay-per-view on the planet that year, and no one in the world of boxing really knew what to do with that number. But before any of them, before the arenas and the accompanying diss tracks and the streaming deals, someone had to run this exact playbook and figure out if it worked. Someone had already proven, in front of a paying crowd, that what people want from a boxing event has very little to do with the boxing. That someone was the infamous German film director Uwe Boll. In 2006, he got so angry at his critics that he flew 4 of them to Vancouver so that he could beat them up one at a time in front of a live audience. Most of them had never trained a day in their lives, and Boll beat the absolute brakes off of them. Was it petty? Kinda. Was it rigged? Maybe. Was it sponsored by a dodgy online casino? You bet it was. Without meaning to, this event became the blueprint for everything we've just gone through. This is the history of influencer boxing, also known as getting punched in the head for clout. The first real rules of boxing were written in London in 1743 by a champion named Jack Broughton. He wrote them roughly 2 years after he'd accidentally killed his opponent following a brutal 1741 bare-knuckle prize fight. I mean, having people dying would be bad for business after all. The rules were simple things: no hitting a man when he's down, no grabbing of the legs. If you get downed, you get a 30-second count to get back on your feet. But this was little more than a primitive frame put around the brutality, all so that boxing didn't end up as just another blood sport abandoned on the trash heap of history. It eventually earned itself a nickname, the Sweet Science. This was technically a phrase coined by a sports writer to dress prize fighting up as a craft for a paying public, not a mindless brawl between lumpen apes blindly swinging their fists. Of course, that doesn't always stop the lumpen apes from doing what they do best, which brings us to Uwe Boll. Uwe Boll's Blood Rain had its world premiere at the Austin Film Festival on October 23, 2005. This has made a lot of people very angry and has been widely regarded as a bad move. Blood Rain was a film based on a video game of the same name. It's actually the third video game adaptation Boll had made at the time after House of the Dead and Alone in the Dark, two films that had earned him a reputation in certain circles as something close to a war criminal of cinema. Gamers felt he had no love or respect for the source material. He does disagree quite heavily with that reputation. Personally, I'm more neutral on his movies, but at the time, people absolutely hated them. Anyway, the plot centers on a half-human, half-vampire called Rain. She escapes the traveling carnival she's been kept in and sets out across 18th century Romania to kill her vampire father. It sounds like a lot, and it's fine, it doesn't really matter. What matters to me about these kind of movies is the casting. Ben Kingsley is in this movie. So Ben Kingsley, the man has an Academy Award for playing Gandhi, and he's here playing the evil vampire king. Incredible get. Michael Madsen is in there, Michelle Rodriguez, Meatloaf for some reason. How that much Hollywood star power ended up in a vampire movie based on a PlayStation 2 game remains an unsolved mystery. So, there's bad movie in scare quotes, which is talking about how the movie sucks to watch, and then there's bad movie in terms of how it failed to make a return on its investment. Uwe Boll's Blood Rain had a budget of $25 million. Unfortunately, it only made about $3.7 million at the box office. Despite being both a critical and commercial failure, I actually enjoyed the movie Mr. Boll. It's now part of my beloved Bad But Fun playlists. When it came to reviewing the film originally, the critics predictably did not hold back, and Uwe Boll read every word. What a normal director does with a bad review is nothing, really. They might read it and complain to their producer and then go on to make the next thing. Uwe Boll is fortunately not a normal director. Uwe read the reviews, and instead of letting them pass over him like a light breeze, he sat there and stewed about it. Thousands of people, he figured, were lining up to call him the worst filmmaker alive, and most of them, in his opinion, hadn't seen his films or engaged with them honestly. And somewhere in the middle of all that stewing, he arrived at a solution that would not occur to a normal director, or even a normal person. He would challenge them to a fist fight. If you write that he can't direct, you're entitled to the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to come find out whether he can throw a right hook instead. Now this is usually the part where I can lean back and speculate, wondering aloud. One can only imagine what was going through his mind. Except I don't have to imagine it because I emailed Mr. Boll. And I asked him what was going through his head in that ring, whether it felt cathartic or whether it even just felt like a spectacle. His answer was, and I quote, "Both at the same time. I boxed 14 years in a club in Germany, so I felt, even if I trained hard for the 4 fights in one night, that the critics cannot really hurt me." Slight spoilers there, we're getting 4 fights in one night, but "the critics cannot really hurt me" is such a good line, dude. So Uwe set out an open casting call for people to come and get punched by him. To qualify, you had to be a healthy male between 140 and 190 pounds. He would cover your flight and your hotel, but he would not pay you. Getting beaten up by Uwe Boll was its own reward. And most importantly, you had to submit proof of your negative reviews, and they had to predate 2006, so nobody could just write a bad review overnight just for the free trip. At the time, he also named Quentin Tarantino and Roger Avery as people he'd love to fight. Neither of them acknowledged it because they're not Uwe Boll. In my emails with them, by the way, he said he now wants a boxing match with Paul W.S. Anderson for rebooting his House of the Dead film. So watch out, Paul, he's coming for round 2. Anyway, Boll didn't draw a single trained fighter out of the pool of possible challenges. He drew a writer, a second writer, a third writer, and just to shake it up a little bit, a teenager. Which, if your goal is to win 4 boxing matches in one night, kinda putting your thumb on the scale. So let's meet our 4 part-time pugilists and full-time paragraph pushers, shall we? Fighter number 1 is the headliner, at least to anyone who'd been on the internet for more than 10 minutes at the time, Richard Kiyanka, better known as Lotax, the founder of Something Awful and the Something Awful forums. He came up from Lee Summit, Missouri to fight a German film director in Canada. Strangely, he'd never actually written any reviews of Uwe Boll's work before this point, so he already failed on one of the requirements, but he does, in an article called "Uwe Boll Wants Me Alone in the Dark," go over how this match came to be. He somehow, for some reason, emailed me and offered to personally fly me up to Vancouver so I could watch him edit Blood Rain, an event which would somehow, for some reason, suddenly make me think his movies did not belong in an official NASA probe headed directly for the sun. Unfortunately, my wife chose that time frame to give birth to our daughter, so I politely declined. Besides, I knew watching a small human being crawl out of my wife's vagina would be infinitely less horrifying than personally witnessing the grotesque mistake Ben Kingsley stumbled into. So I decided to give it a shot. I sent Mr. Boll an email, asked him if his offer still stood, would he fly me up to participate in one of his unintentionally horrific non-horror films, this time with the lure of physically kicking the snot out of me on film. Well, folks, I'm proud to say the answer was yes. Mr. Dr. Sir Boll replied and added me to the list of folks he plans on beating up because we talked bad about him on the internet. In exchange for this incredible privilege, I promised Dr. Mrs. Boll, PhD, that I would actually sit down and review his films, Alone in the Dark and House of the Dead, so people would know I'm completely serious about hating this man and letting him punch me in the face until he decides to stop. Without further ado, I present to you my belated Alone in the Dark review, part 1 of a 2-part series which will solidify my concrete standing on Uwe's internet shit list. And this is a note from MLYP before I read this quote. This is Lotax's words, not mine. Alone in the Dark, a movie by a stupid German jerk who is stupid and smells and probably molests dead children. Although if that last part is considered slander and or libel in Canada, then just disregard it and pretend it actually said he molests living children instead. Internet humor in 2006 was a different time. I feel the need to point that out before we move on. Fighter number 2 was Jeff Snyder. At the time, he was a journalist working for Ain't It Cool News out of Los Angeles. He's since become a relatively well-known entertainment journalist, but in 2006, he was a young film writer whose publication had said unkind things in print, and he was about to learn that those words sometimes come with a consequence. Fighter number 3 was Chris Alexander. He was a journalist and radio announcer for the horror magazine Rue Morgue. Alexander came to Canada planning to treat the whole thing like performance art, which, to be fair, kind of was. Fighter number 4 was our teenager, Nelson Chance Minter from Frederick, Maryland. At 17 years old, he was a boxing machine, coming in at 5'7" and 155 pounds. Okay, less boxing machine, more scrawny teenager. Boll's open call said challengers had to be healthy adult males who had personally written at least 2 negative reviews. And it turns out that Chance hadn't actually written anything about Uwe Boll. By his own account, Minter talked his way onto the card by emailing Boll quotes from Rocky III with Balboa swapped out for Boll until Boll relented. So if Lotax admitted he'd never reviewed Boll's films and only wrote his qualifying reviews after he'd been booked, and I found out when researching this video that Snyder hadn't actually written anything about Boll either, it was just his publication that did, that means that Chance, Snyder, and Lotax hadn't actually written anything at all. Of the 4 men billed as his harshest critics, Chris Alexander was the only one that had actually put pen to paper. The other 3 had talked, bluffed, or got drafted onto the card built to punish people for words they hadn't personally written. All coming up against a man who, if you remember from a few minutes ago, told me he had 14 years of in-ring experience. So we come to September 23, 2006, Vancouver, British Columbia. We have 600 people in attendance. There is a casino logo plastered across the room, a camera crew capturing it all, and a former amateur boxer in fighting shape standing across the ring from a stack of writers who had no business being there. How little business did they have? Well, I have another quote from Uwe Boll here from my emails with him. If I would prep my films how you guys prep your fights against me, I would never even shot a film. Slight spoilers, I guess. Lotax is first in the ring. He was under the impression that this whole event was a gimmick, all for a bit of fun, as it were, so he came out in Stars and Stripes shorts. He turned to the crowd, pointing at Boll, and announced they were harboring a known terrorist. The reports from the night described Boll as grim-faced as he knocked Lotax to the ground in the first round. Jeff Snyder entered the ring next. Remember, Snyder didn't even write the bad reviews he was about to get punched in the face for. Harry Knowles, the Ain't It Cool News founder, was the guy with the history of trashing Boll, but Knowles was over the 190-pound weight limit. Snyder just figured that the invitation was meant for the website in general, and he was the one who fit the qualifications. And I can see how you reach that conclusion. You're volunteering to represent your publication in a novelty boxing match against the director on the understanding that this was a PR stunt. And then in Snyder's own words, then he started beating the crap out of my head. His trainer threw the towel in the second round. Snyder ended up needing an oxygen mask and the attention of 2 EMTs as he vomited on the pavement. Afterwards, Snyder said, and this is a real quote, "I think he's a jerk. This might be PR, but I don't want to keep getting punched in the head." Third into the ring was Chris Alexander. Being the only actual Uwe critic on the fight card, he decided to approach this with some special effects. He loaded his mouth with a WWE-style blood capsule that he could deploy at will, and after Uwe had been working at his head for a little bit, he bit down and spat it out, letting out a big theatrical spray of blood mid-fight. Uwe Boll was, in Alexander's own words, freaked out. He called it his Jedi mind trick to disorient him. And then last there was Chance Minter. Again, let me remind you, the 17-year-old. At 5'7" and 155 pounds at the time, he was by far the smallest person on the card, the youngest by a decade or more, and sure, he was the only one who'd done any actual boxing, but that was just 6 months of training, coming up against the 41-year-old with 14 years under his belt. Before the fight, the event's sponsor, online gambling site GoldenPalace.com, had been desperately trying to convince Minter to drop out. And it didn't really matter because a few minutes in, Minter couldn't continue even if he wanted to. At the press conference afterwards, Boll, magnanimous in victory, looked at the men he'd just dismantled and said, "I like now the critics. Everybody who was in the ring showed guts. Nobody dived." Though to be fair, he did also say, "I hit them so hard they have brain damage. They love my movies now." Let's take a moment to listen to the initial reaction that Lotex had to getting knocked the hell out by Uwe Boll.
The guy's a jerk. Before, I had no opinion about him. I never really wrote anything negative about him, and sometimes I actually defended him. These people talk about how much he sucks. I said, listen, they're just video game movies, who cares? But then he just came out wailing on my head. Now I really don't like the guy. Before I was ambivalent. Now I dislike him very much. You might say I hate him, and now I will side with the people on the internet who do not like him.
Post-fight, Lotax made the following post on somethingawful.com. "Okay, I'm done drinking. I'd like to post some more info before I forget it. 1. There was an actual real critic who sparred with Uwe Boll a few nights ago, who was a real amateur boxer. Uwe refused to fight the guy in the ring. Obviously, he only wanted people with no boxing experience. Anyway, when Uwe was sparring with the dude, the critic/amateur had to quit sparring because Uwe was taking it too seriously and really trying to beat the shit out of the guy. So he just said fuck it and left. 2. Apparently, when we were in another room, Uwe declared he was going to beat the crap out of all of us and to try and win by knockout. Like kind of the opposite of this is all a PR stunt, we will have fun, my movies don't suck that he was saying before. 3. Like I mentioned before, Uwe said we would get training, boxing equipment, and lessons beforehand. None of us received any of this, which didn't quite worry us at the time since he kept saying it was just a PR stunt, and he wasn't really going to box us for real, for serious, blah blah blah. Never trust a German. 3 of the guys didn't even have cups to protect their balls. The only reason I had a cup was because my wife brought me one. 4. The dude after me was throwing up and had an EMT by his side for about an hour. He eventually had to have an oxygen mask on. The dude after him was all bloodied up and looked like crap. They too made the mistake of believing Uwe Boll when he said it was just a PR thing since neither really trained. It's a bit of a shit show all around, really, and look, if you take Lotax at his word, that feels a little underhanded, promising training and equipment and then delivering neither. 3 grown men with no protection on the family jewels alone is a bit of a bad one. And if Boll is telling everyone it's a PR stunt, all in good fun, and then in another room he's telling them he's going to win by knockout, well, that's gone a little bit further than just picking out some tomato cans. I would personally love to see how Uwe Boll would have gone against an actual amateur boxer. Lotax mentioned the one that ducked out after he realized Uwe was taking the sparring a little too seriously, and apparently it almost happened again. Not long after this event, Boll was booked on G4's Attack of the Show to promote the whole affair. He had a documentary called Raging Boll. The plan, naturally, was to box one of the hosts on air. A producer suggested they put the internet comedy writer Sean Baby in the host spot, and that's perfect on paper. Sean had torn into Boll for years online. The key difference here is Sean Baby actually trained in combat sports, Muay Thai and Jiu-Jitsu apparently. And by his own account, the moment Boll learned this large man could actually fight, he suddenly couldn't make it onto the show. The critics cannot really hurt me really only stands up as long as you pick the right critics. But hey, at least he got his documentary, which is where I'm getting a lot of this footage from. So what happened to everyone? Richard Kianka, low tax, remained the founder of Something Awful. There is a long-standing rumor, conversation that this boxing match contributed to his long-standing spine injuries, though his ex-wife did say that was exacerbated when he fell down some stairs. Either way, we're just going to leave him in 2006 in the Stars and Stripes shorts, rather than where he ended up. Jeff Snyder joined Variety as an intern 1 month before the fight. He stuck with journalism, and he's now one of the more prominent entertainment reporters working, running a popular Hollywood scoop letter called The In Snyder. Chris Alexander went on to become the editor-in-chief of Fangoria, the most famous horror magazine on the planet, a job he held for 5 years before leaving to direct his own films. And finally, 17-year-old Chance Minter. You'd assume he'd want to forget the time a grown man TKO'd him with body shots on camera. Instead, what he got was an internship. Minter went on to work on 3 of Boll's films, moved to Los Angeles, and started his own production company. Uwe Boll kept making movies for another decade, and then in 2016, after a profanity-drenched retirement video that several critics agreed was the best thing he'd ever put on screen, he quit and opened a restaurant. It was fine dining German cuisine, and it was good. Genuinely critically good. It got named as one of the best dining destinations in the country by the same kind of professional critics who'd spent 15 years calling him the worst director alive. The bad reviews never really hurt him, he said, because the films made money anyway, according to him. And now the restaurant made good money and gets good reviews. It would have been the perfect ending. Except he couldn't stay out. In 2022, he went back to making films and hasn't really stopped since. You know, he's got some new releases coming out, except in Germany, for reasons. And it's now become culture war du jour on Twitter, so you got guys like Elon Musk trying to big up Uwe Boll movies. And look, I started working on this video like 6 weeks ago, so I mostly just want to extend my congratulations to Mr. Boll for managing to find an audience that really want to appreciate his films. But more importantly, I think, and keyword here being I think, what Uwe Boll did was write the blueprint for influencer boxing. He just did it a little too early. When I mentioned the script was done and my first run-through of the voiceover was done, one of my YouTuber commenters said, they were years ahead of their time. If this happened today, they would have gained mucho dollars. And I agree. It would take another 12 years, a new kind of famous, and a platform built to turn that blueprint into real money. What happens next is boxing meets the attention economy. YouTube is an economy all to itself. The biggest channels aren't just a popular dude slamming his camera on and waffling into the microphone. Okay, some of them are, but the biggest ones are fully fledged businesses. They have merch and tours and managers and rivalries. And the currency that powers all of that is attention. In the current year of 2026, KSI has just left the YouTube group that's been a core part of his identity for the last 10 years, and now he's marching through his local Tesco chanting 6-7. But in 2017, he was running out of fresh ideas. He found his next one on Joe Weller's channel. In August 2017, Weller, another British YouTuber, posted a video of himself boxing a fellow creator. It was only an amateur 3-round match, filmed and uploaded like any other piece of content. Underneath Joe's Instagram post promoting his video, KSI left a single sentence: "Let me fight the winner." Within 2 weeks, negotiations were underway and the two started tearing into each other on Twitter. KSI made a diss track, because of course he does, and in September 2017 it spilled into the real world at KSI's own YouTube convention, where the pair crashed each other's panels and had to be pulled apart on stage. All of it filmed, naturally. What's the point if you're not feeding the attention economy? There was, however, by their own later accounts, a real fight before the real fight. Apparently there was an off-camera scuffle in a London parking lot, which both men agree Weller actually won. But the fight that mattered is the one they sold tickets to, obviously. That happened on February 3rd, 2018 at the Copperbox Arena in London. 7,500 people paid about $90 each to be there, for what was billed with a straight face as the biggest white-collar boxing event the UK had ever seen. White-collar boxing is the polite term for untrained amateurs fighting in front of a crowd. This was almost exactly that, except the amateurs had a combined audience bigger than a lot of television networks. And because of that, around 20 million people watched KSI beat Joe Weller by 3rd round TKO. This ends up making it, by viewership, one of the most watched boxing matches in the world that year. The moment it was over, before KSI had even left the ring, he did probably the most important thing in this entire video. He looked in the camera and called out the Paul brothers. Well, technically he also called out Rio Ferdinand, the retired footballer, but he did also call out Jake Paul, Logan Paul, any of the Pauls, I don't care. We'll get to Jake, the younger brother, in more detail later, but first, Logan Paul. At the time, he was a relentless daily vlogger who had tens of millions of subscribers. This all happened around the time he made his now infamous trip to Japan, the one where he filmed inside Suicide Forest. This was the place near Mount Fuji where people go to end their lives, and he, in his infinite wisdom, decided to shoot, edit, and post a video in which he showed the body of a man who died there. The reaction was immediate and enormous. YouTube said the video violated its guidelines and looked at further consequences for him. He lost projects, made multiple public apologies, and stepped away from the platform for a stretch. So he was, at that point in time, desperately needing to be something other than the Suicide Forest guy. You don't really want that stuck to you for long, if I'm being honest, but that made him KSI's perfect opponent. You don't need to manufacture a reason for people to want to see Logan Paul get punched. Half the internet had wanted that for months, so I guess all you need is a date. And after months of back and forth and press conferences in 2 countries and diss tracks and all of that, because of course there's another diss track, they finally get to the fight night, which happened on August 25th, 2018 in Manchester Arena. 15,000 people were in the building, all to see them fight over an unofficial, completely made-up belt. The undercard would also feature their younger brothers, KSI's brother Deji against Logan Brothers' Jake. They billed it as the biggest internet event in history, and I don't really like to hype up the Paul brothers especially, but that might be underselling it slightly. The fight was streamed on YouTube's pay-per-view platform for around $10, and it sold roughly 1.3 million buys. A number that stacked up against real boxing pay-per-views that year was humiliating for mainstream boxing. The fight itself was a pretty straightforward affair, consisting of amateurs who only really knew how to swing hard at each other, swinging hard at each other. And after all of that, the judges couldn't separate them. It was a majority draw. One judge had KSI up by a single point, the other 2 scored it even. And commercially, that's the best possible outcome. A draw doesn't end the story, a draw demands a sequel, which got the full legitimacy treatment. On November 9th, 2019, at the Staples Center in Los Angeles, they had round 2 streamed on DAZN, a real boxing platform, as the main event. The California Boxing Commission licensed both of them as professionals, which meant no headgear, smaller gloves, and the fight going on their permanent professional boxing records. The man who promoted this second fight was Eddie Hearn of Matchroom Boxing. He's the main promoter behind Anthony Joshua, one of the more powerful and famous figures in mainstream boxing today, and Hearn is on record about how his opinion changed over time. He initially thought the whole idea was, in his word, embarrassing. Then he looked at the numbers. You can't call a sold-out arena and 1 million pay-per-view buys, and an entire young audience that had never cared about boxing before suddenly caring about boxing, embarrassing for long. KSI won that rematch on split decision, helped by a 2-point deduction when Paul hit him while he was down. Definitely controversial, and importantly, official. Eddie Hearn would later put the rematch at around 2 million pay-per-view buys. To put that into scale against the mainstream name, that figure is sitting in the same conversation as Floyd Mayweather's biggest nights against Conor McGregor and Manny Pacquiao. Veteran boxing journalists called it a slap in the face to professional boxers. Men who'd given their whole lives to the craft were fighting on undercards for a fraction of what these 2 amateurs pulled in upstairs. And even if they knew that, I think it was also undeniably the future, and they knew it. I think on some level they were mad that it didn't matter that the fight was good. The audience hadn't come for the sweet science, they'd come for 2 guys on the internet. Both of these guys treated it as a thing they did, like a grudge match, a single spectacle. Neither of them treated it like a career. Logan's little brother did. I haven't spoken much about Jake Paul yet in this video, but basically imagine Logan Paul, but younger, blonder, and if anything, more openly contemptuous of the idea that you had to be liked. He watched his brother fight KSI to a draw in front of millions and decided that this was something he wanted to do over and over again. He turned pro in 2020 and basically never stopped. So while I talk about everything else in this video until he turns back up, just assume he's there in the background, fighting someone professionally once or twice a year. But right now, the more interesting question is, who else saw what KSI and the Pauls had done and wanted in on the same game? When someone proves that something can mint both money and attention at the same time, it doesn't just stay with that person. Everyone with an audience starts thinking, hey, I want a slice of that pie as well. Someone decided they wanted to try and take influencer boxing and use it for good. Do it all for charity. Influencer boxing with a conscience. That's a lovely idea. Unfortunately, as its creator is about to find out, good intentions don't sell pay-per-views. I call a lot of what I do here the crime of remembering, so it shouldn't really surprise any of you that
what we do here is go back.
iDubbbz was, for a stretch of the mid-2010s, one of the most influential people on YouTube, and his influence came almost entirely from a series called Content Cop. The format was simple. He'd pick another YouTuber, someone that the internet already found insufferable, and assemble an hour-long surgically mean takedown of them. Rice Gum, Tana Mongeau, Keemstar, Leafy. He'd lay out their hypocrisies and worst moments, and be funny about it. People loved it. He was functionally the platform's self-appointed sheriff. Eventually, the same thing that happens to every YouTuber happened to him. The internet moved on. The Content Cop era ended. The cultural moment that made him a giant passed. The way they always do, and he was left as a very famous person whose particular kind of fame had passed its sell-by date. So like everything else in this video, he went looking for the next thing, and he landed on a boxing event. Ian has expressed regret that he spent a significant portion of his career running on cruelty as fuel. This video isn't serving as any kind of judgment about that. I'm merely making a note of it because it's quite important when he starts to try his hand at boxing. He tried to do a complete 180, the whole thing built around the least cynical idea possible. That everyone trains for real, everyone fights, and the proceeds go to charity. He called it Creator Clash, and the first one on May 14, 2022 in Tampa was quite rare as far as an influencer doing a big event is concerned. It was good. The Yuengling Center sold out all 10,000 seats. The card was stacked with creators who genuinely trained, some for the better part of a year, and the fights were competitive and real. iDubbbz himself fought in the main event, going the full distance in a losing effort against the YouTube doctor, Dr. Mike. It drew over 100,000 pay-per-view buys, and when it was over, Creator Clash 1 had raised about $1.3 million for charity. Creator Clash 2 was set for April 15th, 2023, again in Tampa, but this time at the MLYP Arena, double the size of the first venue. That meant more fighters on the card, more commentators, a bigger level of production, more everything. On paper, that's sound logic. The first one did over 100,000 pay-per-view buys, so a bigger, louder sequel should do even better. And the event itself went off fine. The arena was packed. There was a huge roster of creators with a combined following of over 100 million. Genuinely entertaining fights. iDubbbz headlined again and lost again, this time to another YouTuber, Alex Wasabi, by majority decision. And from inside of the building, it looked like another success. Unfortunately, it was not a success. A few months later, iDubbbz sat down and posted a video with the very on-brand title for a YouTuber called The Harsh Reality of Creator Clash 2. And in it, he laid out the numbers with a degree of honesty I don't think you really see from people very often. Creator Clash 2 had not raised more money than the first one. It hadn't even raised the same. It had also not even raised less. It raised nothing. Less than nothing even. The event lost $250,000, which meant that after all of this, the 14 charities got nothing. Zero. So what went wrong? A few things, I think, stacked up on top of each other, and a lot of them are pretty mundane. Obviously, a bigger arena costs more. Flights, hotels, and other benefits for even more creators costs more. It probably didn't help that the event coincided with local Taylor Swift concert dates, meaning area hotel prices were heavily inflated, forcing the event to pay premium room rate for all of the creators and production staff flown in. iDubbbz said that somewhere between 1.3 and 3 million people watched the broadcast, and only about 50,000 of them actually paid for it. In his words, he foolishly thought that last year should be the minimum. So he built a bigger, more expensive show and walled it off to maximize revenue, and the internet simply just took it for free. To give him some credit, iDubbbz didn't hide from it like I think some other people would. He didn't quietly fold the company and moved on. He took blame personally, said he was ashamed because people had trusted him, and he made it clear that while he was fine with the organizers eating a loss, he was not fine with the charities getting nothing. He did end up hosting a 24-hour live charity stream on his Twitch channel, raising over $162,000 for the event's partner charities. So they did eventually get something. There was a Creator Clash 3 announced for 2025, and that was eventually cancelled outright, with a statement confirming there would be no future events at all. So if the wholesome end of the spectrum didn't really work out, what could the other end look like? Well, it looks like brand risk promotions. Brand risk is influencer boxing taken to its logical conclusion. It runs regular events built on the premise that you don't need a Logan Paul, or you don't need a charity. You just need bodies, a ring, and a kick stream. It's the brainchild of Aiden Ross. He's permanently banned on Twitch, like I mentioned in the introduction. He's built his home on Kick, a platform whose entire identity is being the place that takes whatever YouTube and Twitch decided they don't want. So on paper, this is absolute bottom-of-the-barrel stuff. The modern version of bum fights, almost, if you will, unsanctioned warehouse fights between people you've mostly never heard of, streamed off the internet's island of misfits. And you know what? Brand risk is now over a dozen events deep. It's doing fine. It's gravy over there. Reportedly, they've picked up backing from UFC's Dana White and Hunter Campbell, and lined up a partnership with Drake. But Drake's also been doing some weird gambling with Kick lately, so, you know, that's just Drake. At one end, iDubbbz was trying to give the format a soul, and at the other, brand risk has proved you can strip the soul and the stars and the stakes out of it, and not only does it still sell, it still somehow pulls in the UFC. That kind of leaves us needing to investigate in the middle, a place where you keep just enough spectacle and just enough name recognition to print money infinitely. That spot definitely has an occupant. He's been in the background this entire video, fighting someone every few months, building exactly that kind of reputation. It's unfortunately time to talk about Jake Paul. KSI fought. Logan fought. iDubbbz fought. Crucially, they only fought once or twice. Every single one of them treated boxing as a thing you do. It is something that happens to you, and then you go back to being whatever you were before. Jake Paul became a professional boxer in 2022, and he's just kept fighting. In 2021, he co-founded a promotion called Most Valuable Promotions. His co-founder in this venture is called Nakisa Badarian, the former chief financial officer of the UFC. Everyone in this story was just a fighter. Jake Paul is a business with a fighter attached to it, and business is booming. To start climbing the ranks of the boxing world, you need to build a record, typically with opponents whose name recognition vastly exceeds their threat level. Usually, this kind of guy is called a tomato can. A can is a fighter in individual combat sports with poor or diminished skills who may be considered an easy opponent, a guaranteed win. Someone that will let you pad the scoreboard, as it were, letting the boxer who wins advance his career with minimal effort. So let's look at his run, I guess. After warming up on another YouTuber and an NBA player, he started fighting MMA names, and that's excellent on paper. He fought Ben Askren, a wrestler. Tyron Woodley, a former UFC champion, was fought twice. Anderson Silva is a genuine MMA legend, but an MMA legend who was 47 years old. These are famous fighters, yes, which makes the wins sound impressive, but they're famous fighters in a completely different sport and often well past their prime. Okay, pause. Anderson Silva and Tyron Woodley gave us a really good example of this. They actually ended up having a boxing match against each other in December of 2025 in Miami. During the second round, Silva faked a knee strike, which is actually an illegal move in boxing, but very legal in MMA. Woodley's MMA muscle memory won out, and he went to defend against the knee, and then ate a fist to the jaw. Hopefully you can see how former MMA guys can be at a slight disadvantage, despite all the years of combat sports experience. Okay, unpause. These fighters are real enough to sell, but safe enough to beat. It is, if you squint, the same exact instinct that Uwe Boll had in that Vancouver ring. Pick opponents the crowd has heard of, and you also have a decent chance of flattening. The problem with fighting cans is sometimes you have to get fraud checked. In 2023, he fought Tommy Fury, a younger man who was also a professional boxer, and Jake Paul lost. Sure, it might have been a split decision, but still a loss. Against MMA crossovers and aging names, Jake Paul wins every single time. Against a real, young, experienced boxer, he loses. But that loss didn't slow the machine even slightly. One thing I will hand the MVP team their flowers, though, before we move on, is their promotion of the trilogy between Amanda Serrano and Katie Taylor. Their first fight in their trilogy was the first women's boxing match in history to clear $1 million purse. That is a legitimately important thing to have done for the sport. Like, the carnival came to town, sure, but it also pushed women's boxing to new heights. After this loss, Jake goes and does what he does best, fighting aging UFC stars and boxers with no real threat to them. But eventually we come back to where we started. November 15th, 2024, Jake Paul at 27 years old against a 58-year-old Mike Tyson. A man who, in his prime, was the most frightening human being to ever wear gloves, now more than 3 decades removed from that prime. A deeply strange thing to sell, and in any sane version of the sport it doesn't get past the planning stage. But the attention economy did not care that it was strange, it cared that you couldn't look away. MVP put it on Netflix. 108 million people around the world tuned in, 65 million households at peak concurrent viewership. It is the most streamed sporting event in history. It wasn't a great fight by any means. It was slow, plodding. It was a very cautious fight from Jake Paul. To be honest, it was a faintly sad 8 rounds between an old man and a very careful one. Rocky Balboa it wasn't, but nobody really remembers the boxing. But everybody watched, which was always, from Vancouver in 2006 to that night in Texas, the entire point. And then Paul made a fatal mistake. He fought a guy that I would call a certified real one. On December 19th, 2025, Jake Paul stepped into the ring with Anthony Joshua. Anthony Joshua is not an MMA crossover, he is not 58 years old, not a name from another sport, not even a young up-and-comer like Tommy Fury. Anthony Joshua is a 2-time unified heavyweight world champion. An Olympic gold medalist, he is a genuine, elite, in his prime professional boxer. The exact category of opponent Jake Paul had spent his entire career not fighting. On the Mr. Versace podcast, Joshua said, "There was a strict message that was given and a task that was laid upon me, and that was to get rid of Jake Paul and remove him from our beloved sport, which is boxing." Jake Paul was knocked out in the 6th round, driven to hospital with his jaw broken in 2 places. Surgery followed, gifting him 2 titanium plates on each side of his face, with several teeth removed, and weeks on a liquid diet. Then months later, a second surgery because the plates and screws started to come loose. And you could read this result one of 2 ways. You could read it from the perspective of a boxing promoter. Eddie Hearn, the man who helped mainstream this whole thing back in 2019, looked at the injury and said Jake Paul's career could be over, that he may never fight again. And months later, Jake himself quietly agreed. Asked if his boxing career might be finished, his answer was, most definitely, it just depends on how the bone heals. The other way to read it is like how an influencer would. While he was lying in that hospital bed waiting on surgery, he posted the x-ray and said, "Double broken jaw, give me Canelo in 10 days. Canelo Alvarez is the best pound-for-pound boxer alive. Or at least one of them. It's an absurd joke, but I admire the moxie. Because to a boxer, that night is career-ending. To an influencer like Jake, that's just content. The x-ray got posted, the hospital bed got posted, the loss is now content. Boxing took his jaw, but he's got banger after banger for the algorithm. Look, I'm not sure if Jake will ever fight again. The business has never stopped. MVP is still there. It's promoting MMA now, fielding offers from Amazon and Fox, growing to new and bigger heights. And that's the thing about influencer boxing. In real boxing, a knockout like that is the end of a career. In influencer boxing, it's just a cliffhanger before your next upload. And I think that's the line, from a German film director knocking out 4 woefully unprepared critics at a casino-sponsored gig in Vancouver in 2006, to a comment with a ha-ha on the end in 2017, to a wholesome charity experiment that failed and went broke. to a warehouse promotion with the bosses of the UFC on commentary, and if Aiden Ross is to be believed, Drake on the cap table, to a 58-year-old legend and a YouTuber making the most watched fight in history, to a broken jaw and a hospital bed call-out. Boxing spent 300 years building itself into something with rules and craft and a name like the sweet science, all to make the violence respectable. And it turns out that none of that was load-bearing. You can strip out the skill, strip out the stakes, strip out the decades of training, hand the gloves to a man who has never thrown a punch in his life, and as long as enough people can't look away, it still works. It works better, even, because the audience was never really there for the boxing. They were there for the people. So the next time you see a YouTuber sell out an arena or a streamer headline a card on Kick, or an aging legend get talked into one more payday in front of a camera, remember that it all traces back to Uwe Boll because he could not and would not let a bad review go. This was the history of influencer boxing, and the only thing I'm going to leave you with is subscribe to me on Patreon if you want. My music is available in downloads as well. It is available under a Creative Commons license for you to use in your own content. And don't forget, the internet makes you stupid.
Walk into the bank with some shit in your pants. 'Cause you had too many crystals and you somehow tried to dance. Walk up to the teller with an awkward grin on your face. Hand over the shitty check to him and it's time to get paid. But he says he can't cash it 'cause it's covered in shit. There's no way to sign it and it's not even legible. No!